The loading dock behind Seligman Farm and Ranch Supply sat in the kind of early March cold that felt personal, the kind that worked its way through denim and flannel and settled into the joints of a man who'd been working the same land for 2 decades. Cal Merritt had been at it for 40 minutes, lifting 50-pound bags of mineral supplement from the pallet to the bed of his pickup one at a time, no dolly, no help. At 57, he still loaded his own truck. Not because he had something to prove, because Ruth had always said the day a man stops doing his own work is the day he starts dying by committee. He had 7 bags left when Dale Hutchins came around the corner of the building with a styrofoam cup of coffee, moving the way men move when they own the room, even when the room is a concrete loading dock at 7 in the morning. Hutchins was 55, rangy, with a face that had been weathered into something resembling confidence. He'd been running commercial cow-calf operations in Yavapai County for 3 decades, which in Seligman meant he had opinions about everything and an audience for most of them. 3 other men were on the dock. Emmett Pruitt from the co-op, 2 ranchers Cal recognized from the livestock auction. Hutchins didn't look at Cal when he said it. That was the tell. He looked at the other men, made sure they were paying attention, then said it loud enough to carry 20 bulls and no cows. That man's running a bachelor party out there, not a ranch. The laughter was the short, reflexive kind. The kind that comes not because something is funny, but because someone with standing said something, and the social cost of not laughing is higher than the social cost of participating. Cal had the 50th bag halfway up the side of the truck bed. He finished the lift, set the bag down, pressed his palms flat against the vinyl liner for a moment, took one breath. Then he straightened, walked around to the driver's side, picked up the receipt from where Emmett had laid it on the hood, signed it, handed it back, climbed in, drove north out of town on Highway 89 without having said a single word to anyone on that dock. He heard it, every syllable. He'd been standing 10 feet away. He just had other things to do. The 60 acres he ran outside Seligman sat at roughly 5,000 feet in the high desert grassland of Yavapai County, that particular stretch of Arizona geography that exists between the Ponderosa pine country around Prescott and the warmer lower terrain dropping toward the Verde Valley. The land wasn't flat. It rolled in the way that high desert rolls slow undulations, with rocky outcroppings at the crests and draws where the soil was a little deeper, a little less hostile. The grass was blue grama and side oats, grama native species that had been growing in that ground since before anyone thought to put a fence around it. They survived on 14 inches of annual rainfall and the particular stubbornness of plants that had evolved for exactly this kind of punishment. Cal had lived on this property for 22 years. He'd come here with Ruth in the spring of 2001 when they were young enough to find the isolation romantic and naive enough to think that 180 acres of Merritt family land could support a commercial cow-calf operation indefinitely. They'd been wrong about the 180 acres. A property dispute with the county had reduced the deeded portion to 60. Over the following decade, a grinding legal process that had cost them $40,000 in attorney fees and left Ruth with a bitterness toward Yavapai County bureaucracy that she carried quietly for the rest of her life. Ruth Merritt had been a woman who carried most things quietly. That was the thing about her that Cal had understood only in pieces while she was alive, a fact he spent the years after her death assembling into something like a complete picture. She'd been quiet in the way that competent people are quiet not from timidity, but from a preference for action over announcement. She kept the books, managed the veterinary schedules, negotiated with the feed suppliers, tracked every head's weight gain, in feed conversion with a yellow legal pad and a mechanical pencil she kept in her left front shirt pocket. When the pancreatic cancer came in the spring of 2017, she kept the books until 6 weeks before she died. The morning after the funeral, Cal had gone into her office to file some paperwork. He'd been avoiding the room for 2 days. He stood in the doorway for a long time, looking at the desk, the yellow legal pads stacked in their corner, the pencil still in the groove of the pad holder. In the second drawer on the left side under a folder of livestock vaccination records, he found an envelope with his name on it in her handwriting. Inside was a single sheet of yellow legal paper folded once. He read it standing at her desk. He read it 3 more times sitting in her chair. Then he folded it back along the original crease lines and put it in the left breast pocket of his shirt against the side where his heart was, and he kept it there for a week before he moved it to his wallet. He still carried it. It had been 3 years when he stood on that loading dock, and the paper had softened at the creases from handling. The list on that paper had 14 items. Most of them were practical insurance policies to update a standing order with the co-op that needed to be canceled, a crack in the east fence line that she'd been meaning to tell him about. But the first two items on the list were different. The first one said, "Tell Garrett his father loves him more than he knows how to say." The second one said, "Bull development." He talked about this in 1998. "I always said wait. I always said wait. I should have said yes." In 1998, Cal had spent the better part of a winter evening explaining a business model to Ruth at their kitchen table. He'd been reading about grass-based bull development programs in the Southwest operations that were buying weaned bull calves and growing them on native pasture instead of grain-based feed, then selling them as range-ready two-year-olds to cow-calf operations that needed breeding stock. The margins were significant. The logic was sound. The obstacle, as Ruth had identified it with her characteristic precision, was capital. They were already stretched on their existing cow-calf inventory. Taking on a second operation without a financial cushion was a risk she wasn't willing to take that year. Then the following year, another thing came up. Then another. Cal had mentioned it twice more over the next decade, each time with diminishing detail, until eventually he stopped mentioning it altogether, the way men stop mentioning things they've learned not to mention. Ruth had written it down, had been carrying it since 1998, had decided sometime in those last months when she was still sharp enough to plan and sick enough to know time was running out to put it on the list. Cal had inherited three things when Ruth died: 60 acres of deeded land, $148,000 in operating debt from the final years of a cow-calf operation that had never fully recovered from the legal fees, and two consecutive drought years. The opinion of everyone who knew him that he should sell the cattle, clear as much of the debt as possible, and go live near his son Garrett in Phoenix. He sold the cattle. That part he agreed with. He couldn't run a cow-calf operation alone at 54 years old, with the debt load Ruth had left behind. The cows went through the Prescott livestock auction in January of 2018. The proceeds covered slightly less than a third of what he owed. He refinanced the rest against the land. He did not sell the land. He did not go to Phoenix. He did not stop ranching. He changed what ranching meant. The math on a notepad in his barn took him 3 evenings to work out to his own satisfaction, though the basic structure had been sitting in his head since that kitchen table conversation in 1998. The model was this: buy weaned bull calves at 8 months of age, registered stock from established seed stock programs, paying in the range of $600 to $900 per head, depending on breed and genetics. Put them on native grass pasture, no grain supplementation beyond what the land itself provided for 12 to 14 months. Sell them as range-ready breeding bulls at 2 years of age to commercial cow-calf operations that needed breeding stock but couldn't justify the price of grain-finished bulls from feedlot-style development programs. The price differential was the engine of the whole thing. A grain-finished 2-year-old registered bull from a premium seed stock operation sold for $4,000 to $8,000, sometimes more if the genetics were fashionable. A grass-developed bull from an unknown operation with no track record could be positioned at $3,200 to $5,000, competitive enough to attract buyers who wanted registered genetics without the premium price, while still generating a net margin of roughly $2,000 to $2,500 per head after purchase cost, mineral supplementation, vaccination routine, veterinary care, and the year of management in between. 20 bulls, $50,000 a year, 60 acres, one man. On paper, it worked. The question nobody could answer was whether it would work in practice, specifically whether 20 young bulls could be kept together on 60 acres without the kind of territorial aggression that conventional ranching wisdom said was inevitable when you tried to run bulls in groups. Bert Calloway came by in late October of 2018, the week before Cal was scheduled to pick up his first calves. Calloway ran 300 acres about 2 miles east, a cow-calf operation he'd inherited from his father, and had been running more or less unchanged for 30 years. He was 62, stocky, with a gray mustache that had been the same shape since roughly 1985. He wasn't a bad man. He was a man shaped entirely by conventional wisdom, which in ranching country means a man who has absorbed the accumulated mistakes of everyone who came before him and carries them as certainties. He stood at Cal's kitchen table looking at the legal pad with the numbers on it, the way men look at something they want to find fault with. His jaw worked. Cal had the coffee on and poured him a cup without being asked. 20 bull calves on 60 acres, Calloway said. Not a question. A verdict. That's the plan. Calloway's voice carried the weight of 30 years of doing things the established way. Cal, 20 young bulls in a pasture together will be through your fences before the snow melts. They'll establish hierarchy by fighting. They'll run off weight you're trying to put on them. There's a reason nobody keeps 20 bulls together. Cal's hands wrapped around his own mug. He looked at the legal pad for a moment, then at Calloway. Have you ever watched a group of grain-fed bulls versus grass-fed bulls? Calloway's mustache shifted. He hadn't. I spent 22 years watching both, Cal said. The ones we bought from feedlot programs came in hot. Pushing fence within a week, fighting for position, couldn't be turned out together without somebody getting hurt. The ones we raised on grass, the ones that grew up on pasture from weaning, they moved different. They weren't looking for a fight. They established order once, and then they kept it. You're talking about temperament. I'm talking about diet-affecting hormone expression. High energy intake, the kind you get from grain supplementation, elevates testosterone output above the breeding threshold. Grass-fed development keeps bulls in a range where they can breed effectively but don't have the surplus testosterone driving aggression. It's not complicated. Nobody's turned it into a business model in this county because everyone does what their father did. Calloway drank his coffee. His face had the particular stillness of a man who knows he can't find an immediate logical flaw in something but hasn't decided to believe it yet. Sounds good on paper, he said finally. Cal nodded once. He wasn't going to argue the rest of it. He'd watched Ruth make decisions her whole life by gathering information and then moving. The gathering was done. He was moving. The first calves arrived on November 3, 2018. 10 had a mix of registered Hereford and Angus from 3 different seed stock operations in northern Arizona. The youngest was 7 months old, the oldest 9. They averaged 460 pounds at arrival and had the uncertain, watchful quality of young animals that hadn't decided yet whether a new place was safe. Cal processed them in the working chute over the course of a morning vaccinations and parasite treatment and ear tags. He assigned each one a number on his yellow legal pad, same format Ruth had used for their cow herd, and recorded weights, breed origin, and purchase price. He'd paid an average of $720 per head. He'd used the last $14,000 from a savings account that Ruth had been building since 2009 for what she called the contingency fund, which was her term for money kept aside for the thing neither of them could predict. He turned them out into the south pasture just before noon. They bunched at the gate for a few minutes, the instinctive hesitation of animals in a new environment. Then the front 2 walked out. The others followed, and within 20 minutes, all 10 were spread across the pasture, grazing, not eating because they were hungry necessarily, but because grazing is what cattle do when their nervous systems begin to settle. No fighting, no fence testing. One calf the biggest. Hereford made a brief show of superiority over the smallest Angus near the water trough, a shoulder push and a raised head. The Angus stepped aside. Order established. Done in 15 seconds. Cal watched from the fence for an hour, forearms on the top rail, the way he'd watched cattle his whole adult life. The light was changing in the way November light changes in the high desert, the sun going low fast, the shadows getting long across the grass. He thought about Ruth. He thought about the kitchen table in 1998. He thought about what she'd written on the list, which he could feel through the denim of his shirt pocket, even though it was in his wallet now. He wasn't sure if he was doing this for himself or for her. He'd stopped trying to draw that line cleanly. The first winter was quiet. The calves put on weight steadily on the native grass, supplemented with the mineral blocks Cal positioned at 4 stations across the pasture to prevent crowding. He'd calculated his mineral costs at roughly $60 per head per month within the budget he'd projected on the legal pad. The veterinary expenses were minimal. No respiratory illness, which was the thing that killed feedlot-style development operations in years with wet winters. Grass-raised calves with low stress loads had immune systems that worked the way immune systems were supposed to work. By January, they weren't calves anymore in any meaningful sense. They were young bulls carrying 700 to 750 pounds on frames that were starting to show the muscling that registered genetics promised. Cal weighed them monthly on the portable scale he'd borrowed from Calloway and recorded everything on the legal pad. The numbers tracked his projections within a margin he could accept. He called his son Garrett in February. Garrett was 31, a software engineer in Phoenix, a man who understood markets and systems in the abstract and livestock not at all. He had his mother's precision with numbers and Cal's stubbornness about conclusions, which was a combination that made him exhausting to argue with. They spoke every 2 or 3 weeks, conversations that were warm in the way that conversations between fathers and sons can be warm when they found a comfortable distance close enough to matter far enough to avoid the friction of proximity. "How are the Bulls?" Garrett asked. He'd gotten used to asking about the Bulls the way one gets used to asking about a project one doesn't fully understand, but has decided to support anyway. "Good. Better than projected on the weight gain. The Herefords are especially clean." "Any problems with them fighting?" "Not one." A pause on the line, the kind that meant Garrett was revising something internally. He'd been skeptical of the group housing from the beginning, not because he knew anything about bovine behavior, but because it violated his intuition about male animals in confined spaces. "Seriously, one dominance interaction in November, 15 seconds, nothing since." "Huh." Another pause. "What does Calloway say?" "Haven't told him the numbers yet. He'll see it when the Bulls go to sale." Garrett exhaled with the patience of a son who has learned to trust what he can't verify. "You should let people help you, Pop." Cal had looked out the kitchen window at the pasture where the bulls were visible as dark shapes against the brown grass in the late afternoon light. "I am letting people help me," he said. "The bulls are helping me." Garrett made a sound that was half laugh, half resignation. He'd learned by then that his father's humor was always entirely literal. The bulls sold in the fall of 2019, all 10 of them across a span of 6 weeks. The first 5 went to ranchers in Yavapai County, 3 buyers Cal had contacted through the livestock auction network, men he knew by reputation even if they didn't know him well. They paid between $3,200 and $3,800 per head. The discount from Cal's target price was straightforward. He was an unknown seller with an unconventional program, and buyers priced that uncertainty into their offers. The last 5 sold to operations in Coconino and Mojave counties, the furthest at a ranch outside Kingman, that had found him through a conversation at the Prescott livestock auction in September. Those went for between $2,800 and $3,200. Lower still for the same reason. Total revenue from the first cycle, $34,200. Purchase cost, $7,200. Operating expenses for the year: mineral vaccination, vet checks, fencing maintenance, $8,100. Net $18,900. Not $50,000. Not what the legal pad said it could be at full scale with 20 head and an established reputation. But the model worked. The math he'd considered at Ruth's kitchen table in 1998 worked. He was selling bulls that went to work on ranches and did what breeding bulls were supposed to do, which meant next year those buyers would either come back or tell someone who would. He ordered 20 bull calves for the spring of 2020. Mixed breeds again, Hereford Angus. One small group of Hereford Angus crosses from a program up near Williams that had genetics he liked. He had the pasture rotation plan, the mineral placement mapped out, the veterinary schedule drafted. He was, for the first time since Ruth died, running something that felt like a real operation, rather than a holding action against financial collapse. He was also in those weeks of planning in early 2020, a man still grieving in the particular way that men of his generation grieve, which is to say he was still grieving and almost nobody knew it. The bulls arrived in early spring, 20 head this time, and settled into the pasture with the same unhurried ease that the first group had shown. Cal processed them, tagged them, recorded them, added a row to his legal pad for each one. The pattern from the first cycle repeated brief dominance interactions in the first week order, established then the settling into the rhythm of a group that had decided to be a group. By June of 2020, the 20 bulls were putting on weight at a rate that was tracking above Cal's previous cycle. The winter had been wet enough to push the native grass into strong growth, and the side oats, grama in particular, had come in thick across the south pasture. Cal was rotating them through 3 sections of the property on a 30-day cycle, a management practice he'd developed in the second half of the first year when he'd noticed the grass recovering better with rest periods built in. It was in June, during the 3rd rotation of the season, that he first noticed something he couldn't account for. The southwest corner of his property was the worst ground he owned. Everyone who'd ever looked at it had said so, including the county assessor, whose valuation had reflected it for 20 years. The ground there was rocky in a way that went deeper than the surface. The topsoil, thin to the point of irrelevance, covered in sparse juniper scrub and rabbit brush, and the kind of stubborn rock-adapted plants that grew in places where nothing else would bother. The grass was sparse there, even in good years. Cal had always fenced it into the rotation for completeness, but the bulls never spent much time there when they had better options. In June, they started spending time there, specifically in the hottest part of the day between 10 in the morning and 2 in the afternoon, when the sun was directly overhead and the temperature on the exposed ground was pushing 95 degrees. Instead of moving to the shaded eastern draw, where they'd always sheltered from the midday heat, the bulls began clustering in the southwest corner. Not grazing, not seeking shade, the juniper was too sparse for any meaningful cover. Just standing. Cal noticed it first on a Tuesday. By Friday, it had happened 3 days in a row. By the following week, it was every day. He walked the southwest corner on a Saturday morning, slow looking at the ground, the way Ruth had taught him to look at ground not just at the surface, but at what the surface was telling you. Nothing obvious. Rocky substrate with thin soil over it. The juniper scrub in the same condition it had always been in. No salt lick, no mineral deposit, nothing visible that would explain why 20 bulls were choosing to stand on the worst ground on the property every afternoon. He started keeping a log, daytime number of bulls in the corner, duration of the clustering weather conditions. He used a yellow legal pad, the same brand Ruth had always bought. He photographed the area with his phone from the same position each time, standing at the northwest post of the corner section, so he'd have a visual record of any changes to the ground surface over time. He wasn't sure what he was documenting. He was documenting it because Ruth would have documented it. He called Garrett in July, 3 weeks into the pattern. He described what he was seeing, the specific behavior, the location, the time of day, the consistency of it. Garrett listened with the careful attention he brought to things he didn't understand, which Cal had always recognized as his son's best quality. "Have you called Dr. Hollis?" Garrett asked, meaning Dr. Ren Hollis, the veterinary practice out of Prescott that had handled the Merritt animals since 2004. "Not yet." Garrett's voice carried the particular quality it got when he was trying to say something he thought his father already knew. 20 bulls clustering in one spot every day for 3 weeks? That's a symptom. That's telling you something. "I know it's telling me something. I don't know what." A pause, then carefully, "You don't have to figure everything out yourself." Cal had been standing at the kitchen window, the southwest corner, visible in the distance, as a pale rocky patch against the darker green of the better pasture sections. He'd been looking at it every morning from this window since Ruth died. She'd always called it the dead corner, not with disappointment, just with accuracy. "I know," he said. "I'm going to call Ren Monday." That was the first time in the 18 months since he'd started the bull program that Cal Merritt had told another person he needed help figuring something out. He set the phone down on the counter and stood there for a moment in the kitchen of the house where he and Ruth had lived for 22 years, in the specific silence of a man who has just done something small that cost him more than it should have. Dr. Ren Hollis had been practicing large animal veterinary medicine out of a clinic on the south end of Prescott for 16 years. She was 44, compact with close-cut dark hair she kept under a ball cap on ranch calls, and the kind of directness that very good veterinarians develop early because farm animals don't respond to equivocation. She'd treated the Merritt herd through Ruth's years, had been at the property 3 or 4 times a year. For routine work, knew Cal well enough to know that a call from him about unexplained behavior from his animals was not something to take lightly. She drove out on a Wednesday morning in mid-July. Cal walked her to the southwest corner pasture section, and they stood at the fence waiting. At 10:15, the bulls began to move. Not all at once. In 2s and 3s from different parts of the south pasture, converging on the southwest corner, with the unhurried directness of animals following something they were certain of. Within 30 minutes, all 20 were in an area no larger than half an acre, standing with their heads low, not grazing, occasionally pawing at the rocky surface. Ren watched without speaking for 45 minutes. Cal watched her watch them, reading her face for information. She had the expression of someone who has filed a piece of data and is waiting for a second piece to know which folder to put it in. "Pica," Cal offered. Pica was the behavioral syndrome in cattle that drove them to consume earth rocks or other non-nutritive materials when they were deficient in specific minerals. He'd considered it and largely dismissed it, but he wanted her read. "I pulled their records before I came out," she said. "Last mineral panel in April was clean across the board. Selenium, copper, zinc, all within range." She paused, watching a big Angus paw at the ground 3 times in a row, methodical. "I want to pull blood today anyway. Fresh panel. But Cal, Pica animals eat. They're not eating. They're standing." "What are they doing then?" She was quiet for a long time. Long enough that Cal understood she wasn't performing the pause for effect. She genuinely didn't have an answer. Ren Hollis was not a woman who performed uncertainty. "Something in the ground is pulling them here," she said finally. "I don't know what, But 20 animals don't choose the same half acre of bad ground every single day for no reason. There's a reason. We just haven't identified it yet. She pulled blood samples from 6 bulls that afternoon, a representative cross of breeds and ages. Cal held the squeeze chute while she worked the same way he'd worked alongside veterinarians his whole life, anticipating the next step without being asked. When she was done, she stood at the tailgate of her truck filling out the sample forms. "How long has this been going on?" she asked. 47 days. He'd been counting since the first Tuesday. Something crossed her face. "You've been watching it for 47 days. Logging it, date, time, duration, number of animals, weather." She looked at him with an expression he recognized from Ruth, the particular look of a competent person encountering unexpected competence in a situation where they didn't expect it. "Can I see the log?" He went to the barn and brought back the legal pad. She stood at the tailgate, reading through his entries, turning pages slowly. "This is good data," she said. Cal put his hands in his jacket pockets. "My wife kept records like that. It's what you're supposed to do." She handed the pad back. "I'll have the mineral panel results in 4 days. But Cal," she paused, choosing her words with the care of someone who has learned that what you say to a rancher about his animals lands differently than what you'd say to anyone else. "I don't think this is a deficiency. I think your bulls are telling you something about the ground itself. Keep watching." She drove back to Prescott. Cal walked the southwest corner again alone in the late afternoon after the bulls had dispersed back to the wider pasture. The surface of the ground there looked the same to his eye as it always had. Rocky, sparse, dead. Ruth's dead corner. He stood on it for a while, the way you stand on ground when you're trying to listen to it. Then he walked back to the barn, sat at his workbench, opened the legal pad to a fresh page, and started a new section of entries. Wren called with the mineral panel results 4 days later. Everything clean. Selenium within range. Copper within range. Zinc, magnesium, phosphorus. All of it tracking exactly where it should be for bulls on a well-managed native grass program. She confirmed what she'd said at the fence. This wasn't mineral deficiency behavior. She added something else before she hung up, low and careful. "Cal, I've been thinking about what I said, about the ground pulling them. I think I want to come back out." She came back in August, this time without a scheduled reason, just to watch. She stood at the fence for an hour in the midday heat while the bulls clustered in the southwest corner, watching with the focused patience of someone who has decided to let the observation lead rather than the hypothesis. Afterwards, she walked the corner herself, moving slowly, reading the surface for what was changing. "The ground is different from July," she said. "Not a question. I've been photographing it twice a week." Cal showed her the phone sequence scrolling from June forward. She watched the images move through time, the subtle but accumulating changes in the surface fractures, appearing in the rocky substrate soil, displaced small depressions forming where the weight had been concentrated over months. She handed the phone back without speaking immediately. A hawk turned slow circles in the thermal above the west end of the property. Then her voice dropped into something careful. "Something is opening down there. I don't know what it is, but 20 animals breaking up the same ground every day for this long, that's not random. That's directed." Cal thought about her word for the rest of the week. Directed. Animals don't move with direction unless something is directing them. By October, he'd added a second log separate from the daily behavioral entries dedicated to surface change documentation. He photographed from 3 fixed positions, now marked with stakes he'd driven at the corners of the area, so his visual records were geometrically consistent. He measured the depth of the largest depressions with a steel ruler on the first of each month. The numbers were small, but they were moving in one direction, deeper, wider, more fractured at the surface edges. He hadn't told Calloway. He hadn't updated Garrett since the initial call in July. He carried it the way his father had taught him to carry things he couldn't yet explain, not sitting still with uncertainty, but moving through it the way a stone in your boot is always there, but doesn't stop you from reaching the fence line. The southwest corner clustering continued through October without interruption. Even on cold days, even when the rest of the pasture offered better shelter, the daily migration to that rocky half-acre happened with the same precision. Cal's log had 91 days of entries. He'd photographed the area twice a week. Looking at the photos in sequence, he'd begun to notice something that was hard to see in any single image, but became visible across the series. The surface of the ground in the clustering area was changing. Not dramatically, not in any way that would have registered to a casual eye, but the rocky substrate was breaking apart in places, small fractures appearing in the surface that hadn't been there in the June photos. The thin soil around the rocks was being displaced, shifted by the repeated impact of hooves over months. Small depressions had formed where the ground had compacted unevenly under weight. Callaway had come by in September ostensibly to ask about a fence line that bordered their properties, but really Cal understood to look at the operation without having to admit he was looking at the operation. He'd walk the south pasture with Cal, hands in his pockets, watching the bulls move across the grass with the easy, unhurried motion of animals that had no particular quarrel with the world. "They've settled in," Callaway said, finally reaching for neutral ground. They were settled in by the second week. Callaway's mustache moved. He looked at the bulls for another minute. "Huh," he said, which was the closest he'd come in 40 years of ranching to saying he'd been wrong about something. He didn't ask about the southwest corner. Cal didn't bring it up. The first week of November brought the change in the light that always preceded the first hard freeze. Cal spent 3 days that week checking fence lines, a task he did by walking them rather than driving. On the third day, he walked the fence along the southwest corner section. He stopped at the northeast post of the corner section. From that angle, in the particular low light of late morning, the ground inside the corner looked different than it had in October. The fractures in the surface rock were wider. The soil around the largest fractured area had shifted outward in a pattern that suggested the displacement was coming from below, rather than from surface impact alone. He crouched down, took a photo from that position, a new angle he hadn't documented before. The hoof marks of 20 bulls, hundreds of individual impacts per day across 112 days, had done something to the substrate that went beyond the visible surface. The rocky cap was broken. Whatever was underneath it was, for the first time in some number of years, Cal couldn't calculate in contact with the surface. He stood, put the phone in his pocket, finished the fence line. That was a Wednesday. On Saturday morning, 4 days later, the sky brought 0.4 inches of rain between midnight and 5 in the morning, the kind of thin November rain that in Arizona came and went without ceremony, too little to fill a stock pond, enough to settle the dust. By 7, the ground was already drying at the surface, the way desert ground dries from the outside, in the moisture wicking up and out into air that wanted it more than the earth did. Cal did his morning rounds, east trough, west trough, checked the gates, started toward the southwest corner section to check the fence he'd been working on. He came through the gate into the corner section at 8:15, moving along the inside of the fence line, eyes on the wire. He stepped into water. Not a puddle left from the rain. A rain puddle in Arizona in November evaporates within 2 hours of dawn, pulled up by the dry air before the morning is half done. This water was different in 3 ways that Cal registered in the first 10 seconds of standing in it. First, it was still there at 8:15, which meant it hadn't formed from rain running across the surface. Second, it was cold. Not air temperature cold. Substantially colder in a way that registered through his boot leather as something that had come from deep rather than shallow. Third, when he crouched down and looked at the edge of it, the water wasn't sitting. It was moving. Not flowing, not rushing. But the surface had the almost imperceptible shiver of water that is being fed from below, the way a spring feeds a pool before the pool is large enough to overflow. He put his hand in it. 54 degrees. He didn't have a thermometer. He knew what 54 degrees felt like on his hand in 61-degree air because he'd been checking water temperatures with his hands his whole life. This water was coming from somewhere that the November air had not reached. He sat back on his heels. His hand was wet and cold. The water was pushing up through a fracture in the rocky substrate, a fracture that had been opened over 112 days by the concentrated weight of 20 animals that had been choosing to stand on this particular half-acre every afternoon for reasons no one had been able to explain. He sat there for 15 minutes, long enough for the cold to work through his jacket sleeve, long enough for the sun to move a perceptible distance in the sky, long enough to understand that what he was looking at was not something he could fit into the existing columns of his legal pad. He thought about Ruth, not about what she would have said, not about the list in his wallet, just about her. The specific weight of missing someone after 3 years is different from the weight in the first months. It's quieter. It settles into specific moments rather than running underneath everything. This was one of those moments. She would have known what to do with this. She would have already done it. He stood up, took 4 photographs of the seep from different angles, including 2 close enough to show the water movement, walked back to the house, called Wren. She answered on the second ring. He described what he'd found without embellishment, the way he described everything: location, water temperature estimate, the movement pattern that indicated upward flow rather than surface accumulation, the duration of the puddle relative to the rainfall. Her silence on the other end lasted long enough to be meaningful. Then, I need to make a call. Don't touch the area around the seep. Don't let the bulls into that section today. A pause. Cal, this might be something. I know it's something, he said. I've been watching it become something for 112 days. She called him back 40 minutes later. She had a contact at the Yavapai County Water Resources Office, a name she'd gotten from a colleague who dealt with rural water issues in the area. The contact had given her the name of the office's staff hydrologist, Ray Kowalski. She'd already left him a message. Cal wrote the name down on the legal pad, Ray Kowalski. Under it, he wrote the date and the temperature he'd measured with his hand and the approximate dimensions of the seep. Then he added a note, water moving upward, not surface accumulation, cold. Kowalski called back that evening. His voice had the particular register of a man who has spent 20 years in Arizona water science, which means a man who has learned to be interested without being credulous, who has seen enough apparent springs turn out to be nothing to protect himself emotionally from appearing springs. He asked the right questions in the right order location of the seep elevation adjacent land use time, since last precipitation event estimated water temperature differential. Cal answered each one from his notes. When he got to the temperature differential 7 degrees below ambient air temperature, Kowalski was quiet for a moment. That's not surface water, Kowalski said. Surface water in November in your elevation range would be within 2 degrees of ambient, probably less. 7 degrees below means the water has been insulated. It's coming from depth. How much depth? I can't tell you without instruments. I can come Saturday morning if you're available. Cal said he was available. He didn't sleep well in the days between Wren's call on Saturday morning, not because of anxiety exactly, more because his mind kept running over the same circuit, the southwest corner, the daily clustering, 112 days of documented behavior, the fractures in the rock, the cold water pushing up through the gap. The circuit kept arriving at the same terminal point, which was a question he couldn't answer and didn't want to answer wrong. He called Garrett on Thursday evening. He told him about the seep. He told him about Kowalski coming Saturday. He gave Garrett the factual version dates, temperatures, observations, the same version he'd have written in the log. Garrett listened without interrupting. Then his voice shifted into something quieter than his usual engineer's precision. Pop, do you know what you're describing? I know what it looks like. I don't know what it is yet. It looks like a spring. I know what it looks like. Another of Garrett's careful pauses. How long has the ground been breaking up down there? Since June, 112 days of the bulls working it. The silence that followed had a different quality than his son's usual thinking silences. It had the texture of someone revising a larger picture, moving pieces to different positions. Those bulls found it, Garrett said. It wasn't a question. It was the sound of a 31-year-old engineer encountering something that didn't fit any model he'd been trained to use. That's what it looks like. Why were they standing there every day? I don't know. Wren doesn't know. We called a hydrologist. Garrett exhaled slowly. Okay, he said. Just that. Okay, meaning I don't have a framework for this, so I'm going to set the framework aside. That was Thursday. Friday evening, Cal sat in the barn at his workbench with the photo sequence on his phone and both legal pads open in front of him. The behavioral log on the left, the surface change log on the right. He read through both from the beginning. June to November. The behavioral entries on the left, dates, times, durations, number of animals, notes on posture, hoof activity, weather. The surface change, entries on the right, monthly measurements. Photographic descriptions, fracture widths, depression depths. The two columns of information kept separate for months described the same thing from two different angles. The bulls had been standing on the water, standing on it every day, driving their weight into the ground above it, until the ground between them and the water gave way. He set the pads down, looked at the tools on the wall, all in the places Ruth had organized them the last time she'd reorganized the barn, which was the spring of 2017, 4 months before she died. Then he said something out loud to the empty barn, to the cold air, to whoever might have been listening from whatever position the dead occupy in relation to the living. He said, Ruth, I think your dead corner was never dead. I think it was just waiting for something heavy enough to knock on the door. The barn didn't answer, the cold didn't change, but saying it out loud made it real in a way that the entries in the legal pad hadn't quite achieved, made it the kind of real that a man has to reckon with rather than simply document. He closed the pads, went inside, set his alarm for 5:30. Ray Kowalski arrived at 7:45 on Saturday morning, 45 minutes before the time he'd given, which told Cal something about how seriously the man had taken the call. He drove a white county truck with the Yavapai County Water Resources emblem on the door. He was 52, broad across the shoulders, with close-cropped gray hair and the particular quality of physical stillness that field scientists develop when they've spent 2 decades moving carefully through landscape they don't want to disturb. He carried a canvas bag with instruments and a separate hard case whose contents Cal didn't ask about. His handshake was firm but not performative. "Mr. Merritt." That was all. No preamble, no social warming. He wanted to see the seep. Cal walked him to the southwest corner. The water was still there 4 days after the rainfall, pushing up through the fracture with the same cold constancy it had shown on Saturday morning. Kowalski crouched down at the edge of it without being asked, set the canvas bag down, opened it with the focused efficiency of someone who knows exactly what he needs. He worked for 3 hours. Cal stayed nearby, but out of the way, in the posture of a man who has learned to give skilled people space. Kowalski inserted temperature probes at different depths along the fracture line, collected water samples in 3 separate vials, measured flow rate with a small weir gauge he constructed at the outflow point of the seep. He photographed everything, wrote in a field notebook with a pen he'd kept clipped to his shirt pocket. He tested the water temperature at source and at 3 feet from source. He tasted the water, which surprised Cal, a quick touch of finger to tongue that Kowalski did without comment, then a longer study of the sample vial held against the sky. The bulls had been let back into the corner section that morning. They arrived at their usual time, 10 o'clock, clustering around the seep with the same daily inevitability, and stood watching Kowalski work with the incurious attention of animals that have decided a human is not a threat. Kowalski worked around them without breaking rhythm, adjusting his position when a bull moved into his measurement area, resuming without comment. He'd been around cattle long enough to not be rattled by them. At 11:30, he packed his instruments. He stood at the edge of the seep for a moment, looking at the fracture, at the water, at the bulls standing around it. His face had changed from when he'd arrived. The careful neutrality was still there, but something had opened behind it, the specific expression of a man who has been surprised by data in a direction he didn't expect. "I need to go back to the office," he said. "I need to pull some records before I say anything definitive." He looked at Cal. "I'll be back Monday." That was all he gave. Cal walked him to his truck. Kowalski put his equipment in the back, started the engine, then paused with the window down. "Mr. Merritt, how long did you say the animals were standing in this area before the water appeared?" 116 days from the first time I logged the behavior." Kowalski looked at the corner section through the windshield for a moment, then at Cal. "Keep the area undisturbed over the weekend. Don't add any surface material, don't clear any of the loose rock." He paused once more. "The flow rate is approximately 2 gallons per minute. That's a real number." He drove out the gate. Cal stood in the yard watching the county truck turn north onto the road. 2 gallons per minute, 120 gallons an hour, nearly 3,000 gallons a day. In Yavapai County, where residential wells were producing 2 to 5 gallons a minute on average, and the aquifer level had been declining for 15 years, 2 gallons per minute from a natural surface seep was not a small thing. He knew that. He'd been managing water on this land long enough to know exactly what that number meant. He walked back to the southwest corner, stood at the edge of the seep. The bulls were still there, clustered around it, their breath visible in the late morning air. The big Angus that had been the dominant animal in the group since September was standing closest to the waterhead, low, occasionally touching his nose to the surface without drinking. Cal crouched down at the edge of the seep, touched the water, still 54 degrees, moving upward through the fracture at the same quiet insistence. Cold in a way that meant it had come from somewhere the sun had not touched in a very long time. He stayed crouched there for a while, his hand in the water, the bulls standing around him with their warm breath and their uncomplicated patience. He was 57 years old, with 60 acres and $148,000 of debt that he'd been working against for 2 years. 20 bulls that were turning into a real business. And now something was coming out of the ground under the worst corner of his property that might be worth more than the bulls. That night, sitting at the kitchen table with the legal pads closed, he did something he hadn't done since the first week after Ruth died. He sat without working. He didn't open the pads. He didn't look at the photos. He didn't run numbers. He sat in the kitchen where they'd eaten every meal for 22 years, in the chair he always sat in, across from the chair she'd always sat in, and he let the silence be what it was. He took the yellow paper out of his wallet, unfolded it on the table in front of him, read both of Ruth's first two items. He'd done the bull development. He was doing it. The bulls were working, and the buyers were calling, and next spring he'd have animals ready to sell at prices higher than the first cycle because he had a track record now. He hadn't fully done the first item. He'd called Garrett more. He'd been more honest with his son since starting this operation than he'd been in the years before it. The slow opening that happens when a man commits to something hard and finds he needs to talk to someone while doing it. But he hadn't said the thing Ruth had written down. Hadn't found the form for it yet. He folded the paper back along its creases, held it in his hand for a moment, then put it in his shirt pocket rather than his wallet just for tonight closer. He thought about Bert Calloway 2 miles east with his cow-calf operation and his 30 years of conventional wisdom, the stock pond that was Bert's only water source for 300 acres. He thought about the drought forecasts he'd been reading in the Arizona Farm Bureau newsletters through the fall. Precipitation deficits across the Colorado Plateau. Aquifer levels trending down. Stock ponds in Yavapai County that had historically held through dry summers showing earlier drawdown each year. He was getting ahead of the data. He knew that. Kowalski hadn't said anything definitive. The records weren't pulled yet. The Monday visit hadn't happened. But the water was 54 degrees. It had been there for 4 days after 0.4 inches of rain in November in the high desert of Arizona. That was not ambiguous. The seep was not a rainfall puddle. It was something that had been there before the rain gave him the right conditions. To find it something that had been waiting under a century of accumulated sediment for something heavy enough to open the way. 20 bulls, 116 days, 1/2 acre of bad ground that everyone had always called dead. He went to bed at 9:30, set the alarm for 5, lay in the dark for a while looking at the ceiling of the room where he'd slept beside Ruth for 22 years, in the particular darkness of a house where only one person is breathing. The water was in the ground, real moving cold. The bulls had found it. Everything else was just what came next. Monday arrived with a hard clarity that November mornings carry in the high desert, the sky a deep, uncompromised blue, the air sharp enough to make the lungs useful again after a mild October. Cal had the bulls check the troughs broken free of overnight ice, the mineral stations refilled by 7:15. He was at the southwest corner at 7:45, measuring the seep with the steel ruler he used for his surface change documentation. The puddle was larger than Saturday. The fracture appeared to have opened another few millimeters at its widest point, the water working the gap, the way water always works. Gaps with the patience of something that has all the time in the world. Kowalski arrived at 8:05. He was alone this time, but he had a different case in the truck, larger than Friday's, and he carried it to the southwest corner with the focused energy of a man who had spent the weekend discovering something he hadn't expected to discover. He also carried a rolled tube that turned out to be a set of maps. He spread the maps on the hood of his truck, which he'd driven into the corner section through the gate Cal had opened. Large format paper hand-drawn in places with the particular quality of documents that had been copied from originals older than the copying. Topographic lines, geological notations, survey marks from a system Cal didn't recognize immediately. These are survey maps from 1894, Kowalski said. His voice was different from Friday. Controlled, but the way something controlled is when effort is involved. Geological survey of the Bradshaw Mountain foothills commissioned by the territorial government for water resource assessment. Your property sits on the eastern edge of a fault zone that runs from the Bradshaw Range southeast toward the Verta Valley. Cal looked at the maps. Kowalski's finger traced a line across the survey, a marked geological feature running in a diagonal that passed through what was based on the topographic correspondence, the southwest portion of the acreage now labeled Merritt. This fault zone produced documented springs in the 1890 survey period. 4 separate surface expressions along this section of the fault. Kowalski pointed to 4 marked points on the map, each noted with survey symbols and flow estimates in the margin notation of the original cartographer. The survey estimated flows between 1 and 4 gallons per minute for each of these spring expressions. They were used as watering points by the open-range cattle operations that ran through this area before fencing began in the early 1900s. Cal looked at the marked points. One of them sat directly under the area he'd been photographing twice a week for 5 months. He put his finger on it. "That one," he said. Kowalski nodded. "That one." The survey notes indicate it was a reliable year-round spring as of 1894. There's no subsequent documentation of it because the open range operations that used it moved out of this specific area within 15 years of the survey. The land was parceled and fenced. The large animal traffic that had historically kept the soil disturbed above the spring stopped. Without that disturbance, the sediment above the spring face accumulated. The surface cap consolidated. The spring didn't disappear. It got buried. The cold of the morning sat between them for a moment. Cal looked at the map point under his finger, then at the seep 20 feet away, where the water was still coming up through the fractured substrate at the same quiet, constant rate it had maintained since he'd first found it 4 days ago. The bulls broke it open, Cal said. The concentrated hoof impact over approximately 4 to 5 months fractured the compacted surface layer above the spring face. The water was always present in the fault structure. The pressure was always there. The cap was holding it down. Your animals removed the cap. Kowalski paused. His voice carried the weight of a man delivering a verdict he has tested from multiple angles before speaking it. The water was there before your bulls. It will be there after them. They didn't create it. They just opened the door. Cal stood at the hood of Kowalski's truck with the 1894 survey under his hands. Around him, the morning light was doing what morning light does in the high desert, clarifying everything it touched, removing ambiguity, turning the landscape into a series of exact edges. The southwest corner, the seep, the fracture. The 20 bulls clustered at their usual distance, watching with their usual patience. Kowalski measured flow rate again with his instruments. When he read the numbers, something shifted in his expression. 2.5 gallons per minute. It's increased from Friday's measurement. The additional fracturing is allowing more flow. He made notes in his field book. At this flow rate, you're looking at approximately 3,600 gallons per day. In terms of stock water capacity, that's sufficient to water considerably more animals than you're currently running with substantial surplus. Cal did the arithmetic without moving. 108,000 gallons a month. From a corner of the property that had never been worth fencing. From ground that every man who'd ever looked at it had called dead. Kowalski closed his field book. He looked at Cal with the expression of a man who has something else to say, but is deciding how to say it. There may be other sealed springs along this fault corridor. The survey documented 4 expressions. You've opened one. The methodology that opened it sustained high concentration animal impact in a specific location is potentially replicable for the others if you knew where to focus it. He paused. I'm going to write this up. A formal technical report for the County Water Resources Office. With your permission, I'd like to include your operation, the behavioral observations, the documented surface changes as the case study. Cal looked at the seep, at the 20 bulls, at the map with its 1894 survey point under his fingertip. He thought about what Ruth would have said if he'd told her in 1998 at the kitchen table that the bull development plan he was describing would eventually uncover a spring that had been sealed for a century. She would have said, "That's not in the business model, Cal." He would have said, "No, it isn't." She would have written it on her list anyway. Write it up, Cal said. The drought arrived in May, and it arrived without apology. By June, the forecast had moved from cautionary to alarming. The precipitation deficit across Yavapai County was running 40% below the seasonal average. The monsoon pattern, which Arizona high desert ranchers treated as a prayer answered with weather, was slow to develop. Stock ponds that historically held through July were showing sand at the edges in June. Cal's spring was producing at 2.5 gallons per minute through the spring, and into summer, the flow relatively stable through dry conditions in a way that confirmed Kowalski's assessment of a deep fault-fed source rather than a shallow seasonal seep. His bulls had water. His operation was not in crisis. Bert Calloway's operation was in crisis by the 3rd week of July. Cal had been watching from a distance the way neighbors watch each other in ranch country with peripheral attention and the understanding that offering help too early is as wrong as offering it too late. Calloway's stock pond was visible from the section of Cal's fence line that ran closest to the Calloway property, a gray-green oval in normal years that had been shrinking since May. By the 2nd week of July, it was a mud flat with a puddle at the center. By the 3rd week, the puddle was gone. 40 cows, 300 acres, no water. Calloway started hauling. Cal saw the flatbed truck with the 1,500-gallon tank going out 3 times a week south toward the highway and the municipal hydrant in town 16 miles each way. He did the arithmetic on the hauling cost without being asked fuel truck time, the labor of a 62-year-old man in 100-degree heat loading a tank 3 times a week. In July in Arizona, in a drought year, that arithmetic could consume a calf check before the calves were weaned. Cal drove to Callaway's on a Saturday morning in late July. He went early before 7, before the heat made the day into something you had to survive rather than work through. Callaway was in the yard next to the flatbed, connecting the outlet hose from the water tank to the pipe that ran to his main stock trough. His shirt was dark across the shoulders. His face had the expression of a man who has been doing math for 3 weeks and can't make the numbers come out different. Cal got out of his truck, walked to the flatbed. "Bert," he said, "I have water." Callaway straightened. His eyes did the thing that eyes do when a man is recalibrating something fast, running through the implications of a sentence before responding to it. "What kind of water?" "A spring, on my southwest corner. The bulls uncovered it last November." Cal let that sit for a moment. "It's running 2.5 gallons a minute. I have more than my operation can use." Callaway's jaw moved without producing words for a moment. "Then you want to sell it?" Cal looked at him steadily. "You're my neighbor. That's not how this works." The silence that followed had weight to it. Not awkward weight. The weight of something shifting that had needed to shift for a while. Callaway looked at the empty trough at the flatbed at the tank he'd just driven 16 miles to fill. His hands were at his sides. "Cal," his voice had changed. The rancher's flatness was still there, but something underneath it had softened in the way that things soften when a man decides to be honest instead of defended. "I said things at the farm supply about you. About your bulls." He stopped, looked at the ground between them. "It wasn't right. I knew it wasn't right when I was saying it." Cal let the acknowledgement settle without rushing past it. Callaway had not said the things at the farm supply. Dale Hutchins had said them, but Callaway had laughed. He'd been one of the men on the dock. Cal had known that for 8 months. "I heard it," Cal said. "I was standing 10 feet away." Callaway absorbed that. Something moved across his face, not quite shame, more like the specific discomfort of having the distance between what you did and what you saw yourself as doing suddenly measured out in feet. "I'm sorry," he said. "Apology accepted." A pause. "Do you want the water?" Callaway nodded once. It was a short nod, the kind that carries more than the gesture suggests. Cal ran 1,000 feet of 2-inch poly pipe from the spring to the fence line between their properties over the following 3 days, working in the mornings before the heat peaked. He sweated through 2 shirts a day and did the work the way he did all his work, without announcing it, without expecting acknowledgement. Because it needed doing, so he was doing it. 2 other neighbors connected before the summer ended. Harlan Pruitt, 500 acres to the north, with a small cow-calf herd. Vince Daugherty, a quarter section to the west, who ran stocker cattle on summer grass. Cal ran lines to both properties. He did not charge any of them. The spring was producing enough. In Yavapai County, in the drought years that everyone in the high desert knew were becoming the new arithmetic of survival, sharing water is the act that defines a man's place in a community more completely than anything he builds or buys. Cal understood that without needing to say it. The spring kept flowing through August, through September, through October. The monsoons came late and partial enough to break the worst of the drought, but not enough to fill the ponds that had gone dry. The neighbors with the polypipe connections came through the summer with their herds intact. Callaway's cows drank from water that 20 bulls had found by standing in a circle on the worst ground in the county. The bulls, all 20 of them, continued their daily afternoon migration to the southwest corner. They stood around the seep the way they always had, heads low, patient. The water came up through the fractured substrate at its steady rate. The circle of ground around the fracture had opened further over the summer months, additional hairline fractures propagating outward from the original break. Each one a new thread of cold water contributing to the flow. By October, Kowalski measured the flow at 3 gallons per minute, still increasing. Cal entered the measurement in the surface change log, wrote the date, the number, the weather conditions, closed the pad, walked back to the house in the early evening light, the shadow of the juniper scrub stretching long across the rocky ground of the southwest corner. The shape of what had happened was not what he'd put on the legal pad in 2018. It was larger than that. It was the shape of a thing that doesn't fit in columns, but that you recognize when you're standing in it. He went inside. The kitchen was quiet. The chair across from his was empty the way it had been empty since 2017. He sat down at the table, opened the legal pad to a fresh page, wrote the date. Then below it he wrote 3 gallons per minute. Then after a moment below that he wrote, "She knew." He closed the pad. Outside, 20 bulls stood in the southwest corner, in the last of the evening light, patient as stone above the water they had called up from the dark. Ray Kowalski's technical report took 11 weeks to move through the Yavapai County Water Resources Office review process, which was faster than any report of its kind had moved in the previous decade, a fact that the office administrator mentioned to Kowalski with mild surprise when she filed the final version. The report was 43 pages. It included flow data from 6 measurement sessions spanning October through December, water quality analysis from 3 independent laboratory tests, geological cross-sections derived from the 1894 survey overlaid with modern subsurface mapping, photographic documentation of the seep's development over time, and a formal recommendation that sealed historical spring expressions along the Bradshaw Mountain Fault Corridor be systematically evaluated for potential reactivation through targeted concentrated animal impact. The title of the report was Livestock Impact and Spring Reactivation on Tertiary Fault Zones in the Bradshaw Mountain Foothills, Yavapai County, Arizona. In the methodology section, Kowalski had included a detailed account of the behavioral observations that had preceded the spring's emergence. The daily clustering pattern, the duration, the documented surface changes, the temperature differential that had flagged the seep as a deep source rather than surface event. He cited the behavioral log Cal had kept on the yellow legal pad as primary observational data. He cited the photographic record Cal had maintained from 3 fixed positions as the surface change documentation. He named the property owner in the acknowledgement section as the individual whose systematic observation had made the report possible. Cal Merritt, 60 acres. Seligman, Arizona. The report was filed with the county in January. By February, it had been shared with the Arizona Department of Water Resources in Phoenix Standard Procedure for any surface water documentation of potential hydrological significance in the state. By March, a geologist at the University of Arizona's Water Resources Program had requested a copy for inclusion in a literature review on historical spring reactivation in the Basin and Range Province. Cal learned about the university request from Kowalski, who called him on a Tuesday afternoon in early March to let him know. He was at the workbench in the barn when the call came in, working on a gate latch that had been stiff since October. A researcher at the university wants to include the case study in a literature review, Kowalski said. I wanted to ask your permission before I authorize sharing the full report. Cal set down the latch. Is it useful to them? It's apparently the first documented case of spring reactivation through intentional or observed animal impact in this fault system. The researcher described it as filling a gap in the literature. Cal considered that for a moment. A gap in the literature. The kind of gap that forms when no one thinks to look for something because the conventional wisdom says it isn't there. The same kind of gap that had kept 20 years of grass-based bull development knowledge sitting unused in every commercial ranching county in the Southwest. Share it, he said. He went back to the gate latch. The iron was cold under his hands. Outside through the open barn door, the southwest corner was visible in the thin March light, the seep running at its steady rate, a glint of moving water catching the low sun in the way that water catches light when it's exposed rather than hidden. The winter had been generous by recent standards, 18 inches of precipitation from November through February, a significant surplus over the county average that had refilled most of the stock ponds that the previous summer's drought had emptied. Callaway's pond was full by December. Harlan Pruitt's primary tank had filled in January. Vince Daugherty had disconnected his poly pipeline in February, which was the appropriate thing to do when a man can support his own operation without assistance, and he'd driven over to tell Cal personally rather than just leaving the pipe coiled at the fence line. Daugherty was a man of about 50, lean, with a rancher's habit of getting to the point. He stood at Cal's gate and said what he'd come to say. The pipe's coiled at the south post on my side. You can collect it when it suits you. Then he paused, the pause of a man who has a second thing to say, but is deciding whether to say it. Cal, what you did last summer, running those lines for free. I've been ranching this area for 20 years. I don't know another man who would have done that. Cal had been leaning on the gatepost. He looked at Daugherty, then at the southwest corner where the spring moved at its reliable pace in the February cold. The water was there, he said. Keeping it to myself while my neighbors hauled from town wasn't something I was going to do. Daugherty nodded once, the same economical motion that men in this part of Arizona used when they meant something more than the gesture conveyed. He drove back to his quarter section. Cal went back to whatever he'd been working on. Callaway came by in February as well, but not about the water. He came about the bulls. He'd spent the winter thinking about something which was evident in the way he arrived without the pretense of having another reason to be there. He drove up on a Thursday morning, got out of his truck, stood in Cal's yard in the winter light. "I want to understand what you're doing with the development program," he said. "Not argue about it. Understand it." Cal had walked him through the operation for 2 hours. The selection criteria for the bull calves, the rotational grazing system, the mineral management, the weight tracking methodology, the pricing structure, the sales network he'd built over 3 years. Callaway listened the way he'd listened at the kitchen table 3 years earlier, with the particular attention of a man who has decided to learn something rather than evaluate it. But where the kitchen table conversation had ended in skepticism, this one ended differently. "My bull costs this year were $22,000, Callaway said. They were standing at the south pasture fence watching the current group of 20 bulls move across the winter grass. 3 bulls at about 7,000 each. One of them had a bad first breeding season. I don't know if it was the bull or the management, but I paid $7,000 for a question I don't have an answer to." "Range-developed bulls," Cal said. "They come ready for exactly the kind of work you're doing. They've been on native grass. Their feet are right. Their temperament is right. They're not coming off a grain program into a rangeland situation for the first time." Callaway watched the bulls for a while. His mustache moved in a way that meant he was adding something up. "What would I pay you for a bull next fall?" "38 to 4,500, depending on the animal." "That's less than what I paid in October." "By 2,500, for a bull that's better suited to your operation." Another of Callaway's long silences. The kind that in a different man would seem like hesitation, but in Callaway meant he was deciding something rather than delaying it. "I'll take 2 in October," he said. That was February. By March, Cal had 8 confirmed buyers for the fall sale, the largest pre-sale commitment he'd built since starting the operation. The word had traveled the way Kowalski's report had traveled, not through any channel Cal had managed or promoted, but through the natural movement of useful information in a community of people who needed it. A rancher in Chino Valley had called after talking to Harlan Pruitt. A seed stock producer in Prescott Valley had called after reading a brief mention of the county water report in the Arizona Farm Bureau newsletter. Not to buy bulls, but to ask questions about the grass development methodology, which led to a conversation which led to the producer referring 2 of his commercial rancher clients to Cal the following week. Cal tracked the incoming calls in a new section of the legal pad. Names, dates, operations, what they were looking for. He returned every call within 24 hours. He answered questions directly without overselling. When someone asked whether his bulls would perform as well as grain-finished animals from premium seed stock programs, he said the same thing each time. "They'll perform the way range cattle are supposed to perform. If your operation is range-based, they'll outperform a grain-finished bull within the first season because they're already adapted to the conditions they're working in. If you want a bull that looks impressive in a pen before a sale, I'm probably not your seller." 2 people who heard that answer called back anyway. Because what Cal was describing was what they needed, not what they'd been buying. Dale Hutchins came in the second week of March. He came without calling ahead, which was not his style, and therefore told Cal something about the state of mind that had produced the visit. He drove up on a Wednesday morning, got out of his truck, stood in the yard with his hands in his jacket pockets, in the posture of a man who has rehearsed something and is now uncertain about the rehearsal. Cal had been coming from the barn when the truck pulled in. He stopped, recognized the truck. The man kept moving toward him at the same pace. Hutchins was 55, still rangy, still carrying the confidence of a man who owned the rooms he walked into. But the confidence was different now, not diminished, exactly more, like it had been recalibrated against new information. 3 years of new information, which is a long time to carry a joke that turned out not to be funny. "I want to look at some bulls," Hutchins said. Cal led him to the south pasture without preamble. They walked the fence line, while the current group moved across the winter grass. The easy motion that years of watching had made Cal see differently than anyone else in the county. The specific, unhurried quality that came from animals developing in conditions suited to what they were. Hutchins watched them for a long time. His jaw worked in the way it worked when he was processing something he hadn't expected. The bulls were 20 months old, carrying condition that showed in their frames and their movement, none of the hot restlessness that characterized grain-finished animals at this stage. "They move easy," Hutchins said, reaching for the right word. "They always have," Cal said. They walked to the southwest corner. The spring was running at 3.5 gallons per minute that week, the highest flow rate since the seep had opened. The 20 bulls were in their afternoon clusters standing around the water with their characteristic patience. Hutchins looked at the seep, at the fractured ground, at the bulls standing in their circle. "I've been ranching this county for 30 years, Hutchins said. His voice had changed from the fence line. The rangy confidence had settled into something more honest. "I never saw a spring come out of this hillside." Cal crouched at the edge of the seep, checked the surface of the fracture the way he checked it every day. The water was moving at its steady rate, cold clear from depth. "It wasn't here before," he said. "Not at the surface. The bulls found it." Hutchins looked at the bulls, at the water, at Cal crouching at the edge of the seep. Something moved across Hutchins' face, the visible passage of a man revising something large. "I said something at the farm supply," Hutchins said. 3 years ago, March. I said it loud enough for the whole dock to hear." He stopped. His hands came out of his pockets. He looked at the ground between him and Cal. "I've thought about it. More than I should have to think about something I said for a laugh." Cal stood up, looked at Hutchins directly. "I know what you said. I was loading mineral 10 feet from you." The words landed the way they were meant to. Not as an accusation, as information. As the specific, undecorated truth that a man offers when he's decided to stop managing a situation and start dealing with it. Hutchins absorbed it without flinching, which told Cal something about the kind of man he was under the performance. "I owe you more than an apology," Hutchins said. Cal looked at him for a moment. At the 55-year-old rancher who'd made a joke at a loading dock about a man he didn't know and had spent 3 years watching that man's operation do what he'd said it couldn't do, and had driven out on a Wednesday morning to look at bulls when he could have kept driving past. That was something. The driving out was something. "You don't owe me anything," Cal said. "But if you want bulls that do what grain-finished animals can't do in a range operation, you know where to find them." Hutchins almost smiled. The kind of expression that sits at the edge of a smile without quite committing to it. The expression of a man acknowledging something he should have acknowledged before. "I want 2, he said, "for the fall. I'll add you to the list." They walked back to Hutchins' truck without hurrying. At the truck, Hutchins looked back once toward the southwest corner, the seep visible as a glint in the March light, the bulls around it. He looked at it the way a man looks at something he's going to keep thinking about after he drives away. He drove away. Cal watched the truck reach the road, turn south. He stood in the yard for a moment in the March cold, in the silence after a truck's engine fades into the distance. 3 years earlier, he had stood on the loading dock at Seligman Farm and Ranch Supply, lifting 50-pound bags by himself, and the laughter had gone into the air around him and disappeared, and he had signed the receipt and driven home and not said a word. Not because he had nothing to say, because the ground under that corner of his property already had more to say than he did if it was ever given the right opening. The bulls had given it the opening. He went back to work. The spring sale in April moved 12 bulls at prices between $3,800 and $4,700 per head. The highest price came from a rancher in Coconino County who'd bought from Cal's second cycle at $3,200, returned for 2 more at $3,600 in the third cycle, and this time paid $4,700 for the best Hereford in the group without negotiating. "I know what these animals do," the man said when Cal mentioned the price was firm. "I've watched 3 of your bulls for 2 years. I'm not here to negotiate." Cal wrote the check number in the ledger. $4,700 for a bull that had cost him $720 to purchase $840 in operating costs over 14 months. Net margin on that single animal, $3,160. The number sat in the column without requiring any commentary. Garrett came to visit in April. He drove up from Phoenix on a Saturday morning, the visits that had become something different since Cal had started calling him more regularly, more honestly, more often, from a position of something actually happening, rather than something being managed. Garrett was 31, his mother's precision in his face, his father's stillness in his posture, a combination that made him seem older than he was in repose. He walked the property with Cal the way he always did when he visited, not as an assessment, but as acquaintance, relearning the 60 acres the way you relearn something familiar after time away. This time he stood at the edge of the seep without speaking for longer than he usually stood anywhere. "It's more than it was in February," he said. 3.25 gallons per minute as of last week. Garrett looked at the bulls standing in their afternoon cluster around the water. He'd stopped being surprised by the daily clustering. He'd watched it enough times now that it had entered the category of things he accepted without needing to explain. The university researcher, Garrett said. Kowalski told you she's using this in the literature review. He told me in March. Pop. A pause, the particular pause that in his son meant something personal was coming through the professional framing. You know what this means? Not the water, the whole thing. 20 bulls on 60 acres, the development program, the spring, the water lines to the neighbors. You built something that didn't exist before. Cal looked at the seep, at the bulls, at the rocky ground that everyone had always called dead. It's a working operation, he said. Garrett made the sound that was half exasperation, half affection. The sound of a son who loves his father's stubbornness, even when it frustrates him. It's a model, it's a thing other people can do. The county report, the university interest, the buyers calling you from 3 counties away. You built something that didn't exist before. Cal considered that. He'd learned in the years since Ruth died that the things she would have said to him out loud were now the things he had to let land without her saying them. Garrett sometimes delivered them without knowing he was delivering them. Your mother thought of it first, Cal said. Garrett looked at him, not with surprise, with the expression of a son who has known something for a long time, but is hearing it confirmed. I know, he said. She knew you. She always knew what you were going to need before you needed it. They stood at the southwest corner in the April light, the father at 59 now with the legal pads in the barn, the son at 31, with his mother's precision behind his eyes. The spring moved between them, cold and quiet, from somewhere neither of them could see the bottom of. I should have told you more, Cal said. He wasn't looking at Garrett. He was looking at the water. But the sentence was for his son, not the spring. How much you matter to me. I'm not good at saying it. I'm working on being better at it. Garrett didn't move for a moment. Then he put his hand on his father's shoulder, the brief, firm grip that men use when words don't have quite the right shape. He held it there for 3 seconds. Let go. I know, Pop, he said. I've always known. That was the first item on Ruth's list, finally paid in full 20 feet. From the spring her bulls had opened in the April light of the year, everything changed. The official filing date of Kowalski's report was January 14th. By April, the Arizona Department of Water Resources had formally acknowledged receipt. By May, the Yavapai County Water Resources Office had incorporated the fault zone spring reactivation findings into their long-term rural water planning document, a procedural step that carried no ceremony but significant implication. The methodology documented on Cal's 60 acres was now part of the county's official framework for thinking about water it hadn't known it had. Kowalski called in May to tell him. He also said that a second rancher operating on a property 14 miles northwest along the same fault corridor had contacted the county water office after reading about the Merritt case study in an internal bulletin. The rancher's cattle had been exhibiting what sounded from Kowalski's description like similar clustering behavior in a specific area of his property for the past 8 months. Cal listened to this on the phone in the barn, sitting at his workbench with the legal pads in front of him. He thought about what it meant not for himself, for the county, for the aquifer that had been declining since before most of the current generation of ranchers had started paying attention to it, for the sealed spring expressions along the fault corridor that the 1894 survey had documented, the ones that might still be there under a century of consolidated sediment, waiting for weight and time and the willingness to pay attention. Tell him to keep a log, Cal said. Date, time, number of animal surface changes. Take photos from fixed positions. Don't try to force anything. Let the animals show you what they're showing you. A pause on Kowalski's end. I'll pass that on. Tell him it takes longer than you think it should. It took 116 days before I had anything to measure. I'll tell him. Cal set the phone down, opened the primary log to the current week's entries. The spring was at 3.5 gallons per minute. The 20 bulls in the current development cycle were on track for sale in October, the best weight gain numbers he'd recorded across 4 years of operation. The pre-sale commitment stood at 8 buyers, including Callaway and Hutchins, representing 14 animals at projected prices between $3,900 and $4,800. He did the math in the margin of the legal pad. Projected gross revenue from the October sale approximately $61,000. Operating costs for the cycle $17,800. Projected net $43,200. The number he'd put on the original notepad back in 2018, $50,000, had been the ceiling then. Now it was the floor. He'd been running this operation for 4 years. 4 years since the first 10 calves came through the working chute on a November morning. 4 years since he'd turned the last of Ruth's contingency fund into something that didn't yet have a name. The debt was at 62,000 and moving in one direction. The reputation was in 4 counties. The spring was producing year-round at a rate that had not declined through any weather pattern he'd experienced since it opened. He was building something. He hadn't set out to build something. He'd set out to do what Ruth had written on the list. The building had happened around the doing the way it always does when a man commits fully to a thing that is genuinely worth committing to. Ruth's grave was in the municipal cemetery at the south end of Seligman, the older section where the markers were modest white stone or simple granite, the names of people who had worked in Yavapai County and died in Yavapai County without requiring monuments. Ruth Elaine Merritt, 1963 to 2017. The dates were there, the name was there. Cal had not put anything else on the stone because he hadn't been able to think of a phrase that carried the full weight of who she was without feeling like it was reducing her. He went twice a year, May and November. The May visit coincided with what would have been her birthday. The November visit coincided with the week the spring had first appeared, which was not a coincidence he'd planned, but one he'd recognized afterward. He drove to Seligman on a Thursday morning in late May. Parked at the cemetery gate, walked the familiar path to the older section, found her stone in the row he knew without looking. He stood there the way he always stood there, not performing grief, not suppressing it either. Just present. The way you're present with someone you love for 22 years, who is no longer present in return, which requires a particular kind of standing patient, open to something you can't define. The May light in Seligman was long and warm by mid-morning. The desert beginning its slow slide towards summer heat, the juniper and the high grass carrying the specific green that only existed for a few weeks before the dry months burned it out. Ruth had loved May in the high desert. She'd always said May was the month the landscape was trying its best. He stood at her stone for a while without speaking. Then, because he'd spent 4 years learning to say out loud the things he would have said to her if she'd been at the fence line or in the kitchen. The spring is at 3.5 gallons a minute, Ruth. Kowalski's report is in the county records. There's another rancher up the fault corridor who might have a sealed spring too. The bulls are doing what I always thought they would do. A pause, the wind moved across the cemetery, warm and carrying the smell of the desert in May. I told Garrett last month what he means to me, the way you wrote it on the list. He stopped. The stone didn't move. The light didn't change. The wind kept moving. I know you would have said none of this was in the business model, he said. You would have said it in that voice you used when you thought I was surprising you, the one that pretended to be skeptical. But you wrote bull development on the list. You knew what was going to come from it. You always knew. He put his hand on the top of the stone, one brief moment of contact with the cool granite. I should have done it in 1998, I know that. But if I'd done it in 1998, I'd have done it without everything I learned in between. So maybe you were right to say, wait. He took his hand off the stone, stood straight, looked at the May light on the desert to the north, the direction of his property, the 60 acres that everyone had told him weren't enough. The dead corner isn't dead, he said. You were right about that, too. He drove back to the property. The bulls were in the south pasture when he arrived, moving across the grass in the mid-morning warmth, the easy, unhurried motion of animals that have been raised into the conditions they're living in rather than transitioned into them. 20 animals, each one documented from the day it arrived, each one carrying the genetics Cal had learned over 4 years to select for the specific combination of range readiness, temperament, structural soundness. He watched them from the fence for a few minutes, the way he'd watched cattle, his whole adult life with the forearms on the rail, and the weight settled and the eyes moving slow across the group. The big Angus that was this cycle's dominant animal stood slightly apart from the others at the south end of the pasture, as it always did the position of authority it had established in October and maintained without incident. By noon, the first movements toward the southwest corner began. Not dramatic, not a stampede or a clustering rush. The way it always happened in small groups of 2 and 3, drifting across the pasture with the purposeful unhurriedness of animals, following something they were certain of, towards something they trusted was there. Cal walked to the southwest corner, stood outside the fence of the corner section and watched them arrive. The spring was running in the fracture, catching the noon light in the way water at the surface catches light moving and bright. The bulls gathered around it in their usual pattern heads, low patient, the closest ones occasionally touching their noses to the water, more contact than consumption. Cal had the legal pad in his hand. He wrote the date. He wrote the approximate time. He wrote the weather conditions. He wrote the flow rate from that morning's measurement. He wrote the number of animals in the corner section. He did this because it was what you did when something mattered. You documented it. You created the record that proved it happened. You built the evidence that the next person could stand on. He thought about what Garrett had said in April, that it was a model, that it was a thing other people could do. He thought about the rancher 14 miles up the fault corridor who'd been watching his cattle cluster in an unexplained spot for 8 months. He thought about the 4 spring expressions marked on the 1894 survey, the 3 that hadn't been found yet. He thought about the fact that conventional wisdom is just the last wrong answer that went unchallenged long enough to become tradition. The laughter from that loading dock was 4 years old now. Dale Hutchins was on the fall buyer list. Burt Calloway was on the fall buyer list. The water from the spring Cal's bulls had opened was running through 1,000 feet of poly pipe onto Calloway's property, onto Pruitt's property, onto Doherty's property, and it ran there without billing, without conditions, without requiring anyone to say they'd been wrong before they could drink it. That was not strategy. That was not leverage. That was the only way Cal knew how to operate, which was the way Ruth had operated, which was the way people who intended to stay on a piece of land operated, as opposed to the way people who intended to win something operated. Winning is temporary. Water is not. October came with a first cold that meant business. The nights dropping to the low 20s by mid-month, the bulls' coats thickening into the density of the previous cycles, the reliable seasonal response of animals that had been raised without interference. Cal ran his final weight checks the first week of October. The numbers exceeded his projections by an average of 40 pounds per animal, a function of better genetics in this cycle, better grass management from 4 years of rotational practice, better selection at purchase. The fall sale ran over 2 weekends. 14 animals moved to 8 operations across 4 counties. The price range was $3,900 to $4,800 per head, the highest prices Cal had achieved across 4 years of selling. The top buyer was the Coconino County rancher who'd been buying since the second cycle back for his third purchase, paying $4,800 without discussion. Total fall sale revenue, $63,200. Operating costs for the cycle, $18,100. Net margin, $45,100. The best single cycle he'd run. He wrote the final number in the margin of the October page in the ledger that had replaced the legal pad in year 3, a proper bound ledger Ruth would have approved of. He wrote it without ceremony. Then he turned to the next blank page, wrote the date at the top. He wrote at the top of the fresh page, year 5 begins. Then he listed the 20 new calves he'd already arranged to purchase in November. The breeds, the origins, the prices negotiated, the projected costs, the projected sale dates, the projected margins. The future of the operation already in motion. He closed the ledger. Outside, the 22 bulls remaining on the property were already on their way to the southwest corner in the afternoon light. They moved the way they'd always moved across 4 years of observation, the most natural motion in the world, the drift of animals following certainty. The seep was there, as it was every afternoon, moving at 3.5 gallons per minute cold, from the fault below, reliable as bedrock. Cal stood at his kitchen window and watched them arrive at the corner. He thought about the chain of events, the decision not to sell in 2018, the $14,000, the 10 calves in November, the behavioral log begun in June, the photographic record from fixed positions, the cold water in November of the following year, the phone call to Wren, the call to Kowalski, the report, the document that now existed in the Yavapai County Water Resources Office, in the Arizona Department of Water Resources in Phoenix, in the files of a researcher at the University of Arizona who was building a literature review on something that had happened on 60 acres outside Seligman because a man hadn't sold his land when everyone told him to. He thought about the fact that he'd been standing on the spring for years before he knew it was there. That the water had been under him, under Ruth, under every year of their 22 years on this property, sealed by a century of silence waiting for weight. Some things wait a long time to be found. The waiting doesn't diminish them. Sometimes it's necessary. Sometimes the finding requires exactly the combination of decisions, Silences, grief, and stubborn refusals to quit that only a specific person in a specific set of circumstances can provide. Cal turned from the window, picked up the ledger, took it to the barn where the workbench was clear in the way it was clear when the day's work was finished. He set the ledger in its place beside the old yellow legal pads, which he'd kept in a stack on the left side of the bench since the first November of the operation. He looked at the tools on the wall. He'd left them exactly where Ruth had put them, not as a memorial, because she'd organized them correctly and there was no reason to change what was correct. He turned off the barn light, walked to the house in the dark. 22 Bull stood behind him in the direction he knew without looking. The spring ran in the dark, the way it ran in the light, 3.5 gallons per minute, from somewhere no one could see the bottom of, through a door that 20 animals had opened by doing nothing more than standing in the right place long enough for the ground to give way beneath them. It had been there the whole time. So had everything else that mattered.